Hi guys, my name is Alyssa Pohl, and in 2015 I became the second woman to ever solo kayak the Mississippi River from source to sea, from the headwaters in Minnesota all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And as I did that project, I was documenting plastic waste and water quality along the way. Before that job, I had been working on coastal resiliency issues for an organization called the National Association of Counties. And because I was working on a county or a nationwide county level, um, I realized that a lot of people didn't consider ocean health issues to be relevant to them unless they live directly on the coast. And so part of my interest in doing that project was to remind people that if you live inland, your the way that you live impacts the oceans regardless. And so an example of that is you might be a corn farmer in Iowa, and if you're smoking a cigarette and you toss the cigarette butt out the window, that's going to roll off the street into a ditch, and the ditch runs into a stream, which runs into a bigger stream, which runs into a little river, which runs into a bigger river, which runs into eventually the Mississippi River, which eventually runs into the Gulf of Mexico and is in the oceans. And so the way that we treat our world impacts the oceans no matter where we are. That was my main point of driving home. Before I did that project, I had gone to graduate school. I have a master's degree in international environmental policy, and I have an undergraduate degree in biology. So I have a science background. And let's see, I have a bunch of questions that you guys asked, and I think they're fantastic questions. So I'm going to get right to them. The first question is, why is recycling plastic not mandated by the government for all states? That's a great question, and there's a few different reasons. One is that the fossil fuel industry, so fossil fuels are related to the plastic industry because it takes fossil fuels to create plastic, and the fossil fuel industries have a lot of sway and a lot of money to pay politicians basically to believe that whatever it is that they say needs to happen, needs to happen. So that's one reason. Another reason is that recycling takes a lot of resources, and although it is less resources in the long run, or at least smarter resources in the long run, it's much more costly to recycle than it is to just create new plastic. So that's why plastic just keeps being made. Number two, has it been under consideration that the price for plastic be heightened so that less is used in everyday life? Yes, that would be a really great way to help mitigate the amount of plastic that is used. You could see it as like a plastic tax, and similar things have happened, for instance, with cigarettes. There's a cigarette tax to make sure that there's less people smoking cigarettes, and that the taxes that go towards that people pay on cigarettes actually go towards health improvements that are related to cigarette usage, lung cancer, and that sort of thing. So there are similar things like that. Another example is there are taxes on our fuels at the pump. And so that's definitely something that can be done. There are models for that, and getting them implemented is the trick. And the way that we get them implemented is by several things: making sure that our local representatives know that that's something that we as citizens want. That's kind of the major way that we could get something like that implemented. Really good thought. Number three, how long does it take for plastic to decompose? Great question. If you think about, you know how in geology, looking at rocks, how like you cut into a rock wall and you kind of go back in history as you go further and further down that rock wall. So you have like, the Pleistocene age and stuff like that, and the dinosaurs are very down far, and then you get a little bit higher, and then you have those old mammals that don't exist anymore, and then you get, to ancient times when humans existed, but dinosaurs didn't, and then the farther up you are on your geological time scale, the closer it is to the time that we are in. And if you do cuts nowadays, you see that there's actually so much plastic in the environment that we see plastic as the things that are settling out, the sediment of this day and age. And some people are calling this the Anthropocene. So in the same way that Pleistocene represents the era of long time ago, scene being like an era, the part of that word scene, C-E-N-E. And then the first part of the word Anthropocene, anthro, is like anthropology or anthropomorphism. That just means relating to or of humans. And so the plastic that we see in the sediments now is being directly related to humans, which is sort of sad. But the point is that plastic doesn't decompose. It might get smaller, it might get broken into smaller pieces, but it doesn't decompose. It always, because it's made of carbon chains that are made from these fossil fuels, and so it just always stays in its plastic form. It just gets tinier and tinier and tinier. Number 4. I know that plastic pollution comes from runoff, but how do they get there in the first place? Is it litter? Is it flying off of waste trucks? Yeah, so like I said in the very beginning, when you're, tossing your cigarette butt out the window, that's definitely a problem. Litter is definitely a problem. And a really kind of low-hanging fruit. When we talk about low-hanging fruit, we're talking about things that are easy, problems that are easy to fix. So litter is a really, really easy to fix thing. It's just a matter of educating people that the outdoors is not their waste bin, and that if there's been all sorts of studies that show that when you take a waste bin and you put it and label it trash, people will put their trash in that waste bin. So sometimes it is just a matter of having the proper receptacle available for people to use. And then, of course, monitoring that receptacle and emptying it. But the other point that you bring up is materials falling off of waste trucks, and that's definitely a problem. Not just falling off the dump trucks themselves, but also just trickling out of dumpsters and trash barrels. So if a trash bin is too full, the wind or raccoons or whatever, there's a ton of different ways that trash can, we tried to put it in the proper receptacle and it made its way out. And there are several different ways that we can combat that. One is education about proper usage of the bins, making sure that we don't overfill them, decreasing the amount of plastic and waste that we're creating in the first place. Different locations have different education processes for people who are doing the waste management, and so some of them are more thorough in making sure that they try to mitigate the amount of materials that are falling out of the waste bins between the time that they're in the waste bins and getting into the dump truck. So those are all different methods. Another thing that is really common, unfortunately, is that once we get all of that material from the dump trucks to the landfill, where does that landfill waste stay? Sometimes it stays in the landfill, sometimes it gets moved offshore and sent to another country. And when that happens, all of this waste is on a large vessel, it's sort of like a floating landfill. It's a huge vessel that moves often to a place like Asia, and there's plenty of opportunities for waste to just trickle off of that, and so it goes directly from that boat into the ocean. Another way is that there are all sorts of natural disasters. So anytime you have flooding, anytime you have a hurricane or a typhoon, those are all situations that cause a lot of human material, waste material, to kind of get run into our waterways. There are other ways as well. There's also just blatant runoff from production sites. And then one thing that we don't think about a lot is just our own laundry. So anytime you have a piece of clothing that is synthetic, and that just means that it's not made of organic material. So what are organic materials? Organic materials are things like cotton, flax is less common, but another one, wool. Those are sort of things that will biodegrade. But anything that's not made of those material, that's synthetic, every time you wash it, little tiny fibers break off in the washing machine, and those go into our sewage, and those get washed out into our bodies of water because they're too small to be filtered out by a big filter or screen. So there are a number of technologies that are coming into play that are trying to figure out ways to manipulate that and deal with them at the source. So there's a brand new thing that just came out, I think, this past week. It's a net made of nanocellulose. So nano just means like extremely small, like more microscopic than most things that we think of. And cellulose is a natural fiber. And cellulose is what all leaves are made out of, what grass is made out of. And so so it's a really, really common substance. And so if you take those nanocellulose fibers and make a little mesh screen with them, then you could put those into the backs of our laundry machines, and that would filter out a ton of little tiny microscopic synthetic fibers and keep them out of the oceans. Number 5, are there any other cheaper and more effective ways of recycling plastics? So let's talk about recycling for a second. So recycling is taking a material that you've already used and then doing something to it so that it can be used again. And things like glass, which is made of silicone, which is or silica, which is the same material that sand is made out of, that recycles really well. Because if you melt glass to its melting point, it stays the same. So you just have to melt it to its melting point and then reform it into another shape. Aluminum or any kind of metal is a really great example of another thing that recycles well, because you melt it to its melting point, it stays the same, and you can just reform it into another shape. Plastic doesn't recycle very well because when you melt it, there's all sorts of off-gassing, and most of the material actually changes composition and is unusable anymore. So there's only a small amount or like a small percentage of plastics that when you recycle it actually gets recycled into something that is usable again. So recycling plastics is not actually a great solution. Not using plastics in the first place is a much better solution. That said, are there any cheaper and more effective ways of recycling them? Not that I know of. I know that there are a lot of really smart people that are working on that sort of thing, and a lot of people that are trying to, rather than figuring out how to effectively recycle the plastics that we already have, they're trying to create new types of plastics that do biodegrade or that do lend themselves more easily to recycling. And so it's those sorts of technologies that might be more relevant to this question, but they don't exist yet. There's a lot of people who have come up with like what they call bioplastics, and that is while it's better that they're bioplastics because the material that you use to create the plastic is organic and comes from something that is not fossil fuels, it still creates in the end a plastic which is non-biodegradable and a problem. So, all right, number 6. How can the recycling plants modernize their systems for the plastic material to become recyclable? So that kind of was one of the questions that I just answered. It's not that the systems need to be modernized, it's that the plastics that we use need to be changed. So unfortunately, styrofoam is a really great example. Styrofoam is not recyclable at all, and we use a ton of it. And luckily, there's some really great places that have decided to make single-use styrofoam illegal in situations like takeout of restaurants and stuff like that. Places where you have a doggy bag, just don't make them out of styrofoam. That's a really, really easy and obvious and wonderful place to start. But styrofoam is simply not recyclable. And so it's not a matter of modernizing the recycling plants. It's really a matter of creating materials and using materials that are better suited to reuse and for recyclability. 7. Is the coronavirus increasing the amount of plastic pollution? Companies are creating more plastic packaged goods due to high demand, and more plastic bags are being used as people buy in bulk. But people are throwing their trash away primarily inside, since we're all trying to stay inside. So is there still a lot of trash headed to our oceans during this time? This is super solid. This is super solid thought process. So I would say there's a little bit of a mixed bag, but definitely your mind is in the right place as far as being analytical about how you're thinking about these questions. So I don't know the numbers. I don't know if coronavirus is increasing the amount of plastic pollution. My instinct is to say it's probably about the same because, like you said, people are still buying all of this stuff and we're still throwing it away even though we're staying inside. There might be slightly less purchasing going on right now in general, just because a lot of people don't have jobs. So if the amount of plastic is changed, it might be decreased for that reason. One thing that we don't think a lot about is the fact that medical materials are often made out of plastics, and that's for several very good reasons. Like, plastics lend themselves to single usage and therefore sterility, which is imperative in medical situations. And plastics are much lighter than things like wood or glass or metal. And so it's easier to send and cheaper to send materials that are made out of plastics because it's just lighter in weight. And it's easier, you don't have to have sterilizing techniques available. Like, we used to have, all of our syringes used to be made of glass and they broke and they had to be sterilized in between usages. And I think that there is space for that still to happen. But in general, most people have just switched over to plastics. And I think that, like I said, there's really good reason for that. But in the current situation with coronavirus, there are a lot more of these materials being used. And because of the nature of the virus, rather than being sterilized, things are just being thrown away. So anytime there is more medical waste, there is more plastic waste in this day and age. 8. In California, the state banned single use of plastic bags. If the entire United States considered this ban, would this drastically change the amount of plastic on beaches and oceans, or does this change only need to happen in coastal states? Great question. So several different things I want to say about this. So one is that this should happen all over, not just the coastal states and not just the states, but all over the world. The more we can institute a ban on single-use plastics, the more it's going to benefit our Earth, particularly when there are easy solutions that are not plastic. So we all are using, canvas bags and stuff like that to get our groceries. That's a great and easy solution. It doesn't take that large of a behavioral change. That makes a difference. That said, so when I was paddling down the Mississippi, the types of things that I found most commonly, well, guess what they were. Can you guess what I found most commonly? And I will say that what I found most commonly is echoed in what is found most commonly in the oceans all over the world. I'll give you a second to kind of think about what those might be. Okay, so the things that I found most commonly were cigarette butts, plastic bags, straws, styrofoam. So those are kind of the things that I found most often. So if you can decrease measurably any one of those things, you're going to have a really great impact on the ocean. That said, it's still just a drop in the bucket because there's so much out there and there's so many things that aren't those foremost common things. So every little bit helps. It's very important, and yet there's always more that we can do. I also want to say, we were talking about, in my plastic pollutions group, we were talking about how there's a lot of people who think in this time of coronavirus that bringing bags from home is not sanitary and it's not safe, and so therefore we should be using plastic bags even in places where plastic bags have been banned. And that is not true. It's entirely safe. You want to make sure that your canvas bags at home, that you're washing them regularly. And you want to make sure that if you're using them outside of the home during this time, that when you do take them out, when you take them home, that you're sanitizing them the same way that you should be sanitizing your face masks and anything else that you bring back into your house. But it is completely fine. What you don't want is to make the people who work at the grocery store touch your things. That's where the issue lies. You want to make sure that they're staying safe by you not putting them in harm's way by making them bag your own groceries. So bag your own groceries, keep the bag sanitized, and using non-plastic bags in this time is perfectly fine. And the solution also doesn't have to just be a dichotomy between plastic bags and canvas bags from home. You can also use paper bags if that's an option. So, all right. Number 9, the United States uses about 35.4 million tons of plastic each year, and they end up in places such as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. If the United States keeps their habits of using tons and tons of plastic each year, how will this continue to impact the garbage patches? Yes. So the garbage patch is something that we hear a lot about. We hear that it's twice the size of Texas, and it makes a big mental impression to think of these garbage patches. But one thing that I want to clear up is that this garbage patch, although it's a real thing that happens because of the circulating currents in the ocean, and so it all conglomerates in one space where there is more plastic than there is in the rest of the oceans. Two things. It's not an island of plastic, so it's not floating on the top. It's actually throughout the water column, so it goes all the way from the top to the ocean floor and then everything in between. And it's also not solid. It's something that the animals can swim through. It's something that boats can make their way through. And so it's really difficult to clean something like a garbage patch because in and amongst all of the plastic is all of this wildlife. And so you can't just like scoop it up and get rid of it. If you scooped it up and got rid of it, you would be getting rid of tons and tons and tons of plankton and fish and algae and all sorts of other crustaceans and other creatures. So the other thing about it's rather than thinking of the garbage patches as patches, think about plastic in the oceans as fog or smog. And just how it makes it more dense to be able to see through. So like, it's not like you can necessarily see smog. You can't take a picture in a moment and be like, here's smog. But you can take a picture of a skyline and you might not be able to see buildings that you could see, a decade ago or something like that. And so plastic waste in the oceans is kind of much more like smog in that way. Okay, but to the question, so the United States has an incredible penchant for using plastics on a person-by-person basis. So we have a very high standard of living, and we tend to use a ton of plastics. That said, we're also really pretty good comparatively at getting rid of our plastics in a relatively intelligent and safe manner, ecologically safe manner. Like, we have pretty good systems to get rid of garbage, whether they work 100% or not. There are countries in the world, particularly in Asia, where although people use way, way, way less plastic on a person-to-person level, there's more waste because they just don't have the infrastructure to handle it. The reason that, if just 1% of our garbage falls off the dump trucks and ends up in the oceans, that's still a huge amount because we use so much more plastics than people in other parts of the world. So to the question, people who have higher standards of living tend to have worse consumption habits, worse in terms of ecological frailty. So that the garbage patches will continue to grow as long as there are people contributing to those, to the trash, no matter where they are in the world. Number 10 question, this seems to be a global issue. Can the United Nations help countries such as in places like Africa and Asia with their inefficient garbage and recycling collecting systems? So we want to be careful that our solutions to environmental issues are also solutions to social justice issues. Those things actually go very close hand in hand. So places like Asia and Africa, where we have a series of developing countries, they are we're trying to help them in many ways to achieve the sort of lifestyle that we are able to enjoy. But we want to make sure that we're not demonizing them for not having systems in place. And it is really important that we, as countries who have sort of set the bar really high in some ways, like we have a really high standard of living, so we've set the bar high there, but really low in other ways, like we have a very throwaway culture, and that's not great. So we want to be able to pass on the good parts of our culture without passing on the bad parts of our culture. And I think that it's our responsibility to do so. The United Nations is a really great place to start with that. There's, the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, UNEP. They do attempt to solve some of these problems, as well as issues with, they've done a lot of work on stoves in the past decade or so, just trying to help all of the people who traditionally cook their dinners and their breakfasts and their food over open fires. That's incredibly bad for the environment, and so they have helped to provide availability to stoves, which burn a lot cleaner and really help to decrease the amount of particulate matter in the air. So there are a lot of solutions that are out there that are helping these kinds of things, and I love that you are thinking about this on a global scale. So that gets to the end of those 10 questions. I thought those were fantastic questions. I really encourage you guys to continue thinking about these things. And if you have further questions, I'm available for your questions and talking more. Thanks so much.